The gravel track had been abandoned by the Forestry Commission sometime in the late 90s. If the rusted signs were any indication, Eliza adjusted the straps of her panniers, the worn canvas clicking against the steel rack of her bike. Her thighs burned with a dull, familiar ache, the kind earned from 40 miles of rolling limestone hills and a headwind that felt like pushing through wet wool. She had set out from the valley town at dawn, chasing nothing more complicated than silence, a flask of lukewarm black coffee, and the simple, rhythmic mediation of the petals. The trees here were different. Down in the valley, the monoculture of commercial pine marched in straight, militaristic rows, all needle drop and gloom. But as she climbed higher, following the faint contour of an old logging trail where ferns had swallowed the ruts, the forest shifted. Oak and ancient beech took over, their trunks swollen and moss-bearded, twisting into shapes that suggested slow tectonic movement. The air changed, too. It lost the dry, resinous smell of the pine plantations and took on a rich, damp tang. Decay and wet earth, mixed with something sharper, like crushed mint and ozone after a heavy summer storm. She rounded a bend where a massive windfall had torn a gash in the canopy. Sunlight, slanting through the high leaves in thick, golden pillars, hit a low stone wall half submerged in bracken. Embedded in the wall was an iron gate, its bars wrought into the shape of thorned briars. It wasn't locked. In fact, the latch had rusted away entirely, leaving the double gate slightly ajar, a dark gap of 3 or 4 inches where the shadows inside looked impossibly deep, almost indigo against the sunlit greens of the outer woods. Eliza stopped, planting one cleated shoe on the damp moss. There was a sound, not of wind in the leaves, but of something settling. A low, resonant hum, like the plucked string of a cello heard from underwater. "Right," she murmured, wiping a streak of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Turn back before dark, or see what's through the gate." She looked at her watch. 4:15. Summer days were long, but mountain shadows fell fast. Yet the curiosity didn't feel like a choice. It felt like gravity. She leaned the bike against a mossy stump, unclipped her helmet, and hung it over the handlebars. Then she pushed the iron gate open. It didn't shriek on rusted hinges. It moved with a smooth, oiled silence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Stepping through was like walking through a warm curtain of water. The temperature dropped instantly, not with a chill, but with a profound, enveloping coolness that eased the heat in her muscles. The sounds of the outside world, the distant whine of logging trucks on the distant highway, the sharp call of blue jays, vanished completely, swallowed by a heavy, velvet hush. The path inside was paved with smooth, gray cobblestones, completely overgrown with a cushion of silver-green moss that muffled her footsteps. Giant ferns, twice the height of her bicycle, arched over the way, their fronds trembling even though there was no breeze. Eliza walked slowly, leading her bike by the grips. The light here was impossible. It didn't come from the sky, though the canopy above was broken with patches of blue. Instead, the light seemed to emanate from the flora itself, a soft, pearlescent glow rising from the carpets of tiny, bell-shaped flowers that lined the path. Their petals were the color of bruised plums, and as she passed, they turned slowly on their stems, tracking her movement like hundreds of tiny, blind eyes. "Okay," she whispered, her voice sounding muffled and flat, as if she were speaking inside a recording studio. "This is objectively weird." She kept going because turning back felt less logical than pressing forward. The forest was vast, far larger on the inside than the narrow strip of timbered ridge could possibly accommodate. After 10 minutes of gentle descent, the narrow path opened into a wide clearing where the trees stood back like courtiers giving way to a monarch. In the center of the clearing stood a tree unlike any Eliza had ever seen. It was colossal, its trunk so wide it would have taken 20 people holding hands to span it. But it wasn't wood, not entirely. The bark gleamed with the dark, iridescent sheen of polished gunmetal, veined with silver sap that pulsed sluggishly beneath the surface like blood in a vein. From its massive boughs hung thousands of glass-like pods, each the size of a human fist, glowing with a steady amber radiance. Beneath its sprawling roots, which humped out of the earth like sleeping dragons, sat a stone basin filled with clear, still water. Eliza leaned her bike against a nearby sapling and walked toward the basin. Her reflection in the water didn't look quite right. It was sharper, clearer than reality, and when she moved her hand, the reflection didn't follow instantly. It lagged by a fraction of a second, as if the water were remembering her movements rather than mirroring them. "You shouldn't have brought the iron," a voice said. Eliza spun around, her heart jumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. Sitting on a flat stone near the base of the metal tree was a man, or something shaped like a man. He wore a coat the color of autumn leaf mold, and his hair was long, tangled with dry twigs and tiny luminous white fungi that blinked like miniature stars. His eyes were entirely silver, no pupils, no irises, just two pools of polished metal reflecting the amber light of the pods above. "I didn't think," Eliza said, her voice tighter than she intended. She kept her hands open at her sides, away from her pockets, away from any tool she might have carried. The gate was open. "Gates are always open to those who don't know how to close them," the man said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded tired, with the dry, rasping cadence of autumn leaves driven across gravel. He stood up, unfolding to an impossible height, his limbs slightly too long, his fingers ending in nails that curved like falcon talons but were clear as horn. "And you carry cold iron, a machine of wheels and chains. It rattles the peace of the place." "It's just a bicycle," Eliza said, taking a half step back toward her machine. "I can leave. I'm just exploring." "Exploring?" the man repeated, tasting the word as if it were bitter. "An old human habit. You find a door, you turn the knob. You find a lock, you break it. You see a silence, and you fill it with your noise." He walked closer, his movements fluid and silent, lacking the jerky mechanical nature of human walking. He stopped a few feet away, tilting his head. The scent of him was overwhelming, not unpleasant, but intense. Crushed pine needles, cold river stones, and the sharp, coppery tang of old blood. "You're afraid," he noted. "Of course I'm afraid," Eliza said, chin coming up. Fear was there, yes, but beneath it was a stubborn core of irritation. She had spent 10 years riding through remote backcountry, fixing blown tires in freezing rain, and navigating trail maps in the dark. She wasn't about to be cowed by a tall man with moss in his hair. "You're living in a secret forest that defies the laws of geometry and botany. If I weren't afraid, I'd be an idiot." A slow, strange sound came from the man's throat, a dry, clicking rattle that might have been a laugh. "An idiot with good tires," he said, looking past her shoulder at the touring bike. "What is its name?" "It doesn't have a name," Eliza said. "It's a Trek 520. "Trek," the man murmured. "A good, honest word for a hard thing. My name is Kaylin. Or it was, before the trees learned to speak without words." "Eliza. Eliza," he tested. "The Iron Bringer. I told you, it's just a bike." "Nothing here is just anything," Kaylin said, turning back toward the great metal tree. "Everything is weighted. Everything remembers why it was planted. Look at the water." Eliza hesitated, then stepped back to the stone basin. She looked down again. This time the reflection wasn't her. It was a road, a long, empty stretch of asphalt winding through flat, sun-baked plains under a huge, indifferent sky. A single figure was cycling away from the viewer, small and lonely against the horizon, the panniers swaying with every stroke. "What is that?" she whispered. "That is what you were running from," Kaylin said softly. "Or what you were running toward. The water shows the truth of the rider, not the weight of the machine." Eliza stared at the image. The plane in the water looked hot, dusty, and impossibly distant from the cool, humming gloom of the enchanted woods. It was a road she had dreamed about during her last winter in the city, a trip she had planned for 3 years before the job. The mortgage and the quiet erosion of her daily routine had buried it under a pile of postponed intentions. "I had to work," she said defensively to the water. "You can't just ride across the continent on a whim." "Why not?" Kaylin asked, turning his silver eyes upon her. "The road is there. The wheels turn. The only thing stopping you is the little box you built around your life." "It's not a box, it's a foundation." "A cage is a foundation too," Kaylin replied. "It keeps the floor from dropping away, but it stops you from seeing the stars." They sat by the basin as the amber pods above began to glow brighter, casting long, fractured shadows across the clearing. Kaylin didn't offer food, and Eliza didn't ask. She pulled a bruised apple from her handlebar bag and shared it, cutting it with her multi-tool, the small stainless steel blade flashing brightly against the dim, enchanted light. Kaylin looked at the blade with mild curiosity. "Cold iron," he said again. "We used to make swords of it. Now you make toys that roll." "Toys that got me 40 miles up a mountain," Eliza pointed out, crunching into the apple. "Don't underestimate a good drivetrain." "I don't underestimate anything that moves by human will," Kaylin said. "Most things stop. The river goes down, the stone falls, the leaf drops. Only you creatures insist on pushing yourselves up the hill when there is no meat at the top." "Sometimes the hill is the point." "A strange philosophy. It's called stubbornness," Eliza said. "My grandfather had it. He built a boat in his basement that was too wide to fit through the door. Everyone told him he was an idiot. He had to take the wall down to get it out." "Did it float?" "Like a swan," Eliza smiled, the memory warming her chest. "He sailed it down the coast until the ribs rotted out." Kaylin was quiet for a long time. The humming of the metal tree deepened, vibrating through the soles of Eliza's shoes, a low mammalian purr that seemed to sync with the beat of her heart. "Your grandfather would have liked this forest," Kaylin said quietly. "He would have tried to pave it, or he would have sat down and shared his tobacco with the badgers. Probably both." As twilight deepened outside the iron gate, though here it was only an intensification of the indigo shadows, Eliza realized she needed to leave. The battery on her headlight was small, good for maybe 2 hours of gravel descent, and the thought of navigating those root-strewn tracks in the dark with a head full of moss men and glowing trees was unappealing. She stood up and stretched, her joints cracking with a sharp pop that sounded entirely too loud in the stillness. "I have to go," she said. Kaylin didn't move from his stone. He looked up at her, his silver eyes catching the amber light of the pods. "You can leave through the gate, Eliza, but the road in the water doesn't close just because you turn your back on it." "I know where my bike is," she said. "Your bike is just iron and rubber," Kaylin replied. "It was your legs that brought you here." The ride back down the mountain was a blur of shadows and shifting gravel. She found her way out through the briar gates without difficulty. They swung open for her as she approached, though she could have sworn she hadn't touched them. Once outside the stone wall, the air hit her like a physical blow, dry, warm, smelling of pine resin and exhaust from the valley far below. The transition was violent. The silence of the enchanted woods vanished, replaced immediately by the dry rustle of ordinary pine needles under her tires, the distant, mechanical clatter of a freight train miles away in the canyon, and the steady, reassuring hum of her own breathing. She stopped 50 yards down the trail, leaning her foot against a stump to check her chain. Her hands were steady. Her legs felt light, almost buoyant. as if the gravity of the mountain had loosened its grip on her bones. Before swinging her leg back over the saddle, she reached into her pannier and pulled out the small, stainless steel multi-tool. She unfolded the knife blade, looking down at the flat, dull gray of modern metallurgy. Clinging to the hinge, wedged deep in the pivot where the screwdriver folded away, was a single, tiny frond of moss. It wasn't green. It was a pale, translucent silver, and it was still damp. Eliza stared at it for a long moment. Then she snapped the blade shut, slid the tool back into its pouch, and clipped her shoes into the pedals. The sun was dropping below the western ridge, painting the sky in strokes of bruised purple and burning gold. Below her, the gravel road wound downward into the darkening valley, stretching out in a long, white ribbon toward the plains she hadn't seen yet. She didn't turn back to look at the stone wall. She just shifted up a gear, stood on the pedals, and let the gravity take her.